Hello and welcome to this mini episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health, the show all about simple ideas for better mental health and well-being. This week on episode 65 of the podcast, I'm talking about resistance. And in this short video, I'll cover 5 simple ideas for overcoming resistance. First, what is resistance? Well, it really is the refusal to accept or comply with something, or resisting the idea of doing things that you just don't want to do. And unfortunately, there is always going to be things in our life that we don't necessarily want to do. Whether that's a healthy thing or whether that's something that's just painful to have to do, unfortunately, sometimes we have to just suck it up and do what we need to do. It also comes down to things in terms of self-improvement, because if you want to improve your well-being, then you're going to need to be able to fight through that inevitable resistance. And most of us will resist at least once or twice a day. The question there is, why does it happen? Well, it happens because we're hardwired to seek safety and security. And so when we are faced with the need to do something that we don't necessarily really want to do, or that might be a bit difficult, our resistance kicks in. And it can be easier for us to just say, well, I'm not going to go and exercise, or I'm just going to sit on the couch instead and eat a bag of chips, which I've been definitely having to deal with that quite a few times in my life. But the thing is that when we resist the healthy stuff that we need to do, or instead we choose to do the unhealthy stuff, what we do is we actually make life more difficult for ourselves. And that applies in all contexts. It's physical, mental, spiritual, social, emotional, and financial. Even though things may not be necessarily what you want to do, sometimes you just have to push yourself through them. So how do you do that? How do you overcome resistance, especially when it's something that you know that you need to focus on? Well, let me talk about 5 ideas from the podcast. And if you would like more, you can listen to the full episode on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are found. So number 1 is to accept that all things start with awareness and acceptance. What I'm saying here is, don't resist your resistance. Instead, acknowledge it, understand it, and accept it. Because if you try to resist the fact that you're resisting, what you're actually doing is going around in circles and making things more difficult than they need to be. So if you take the time to acknowledge and accept the fact that you are feeling resistance, that's great, because what it does is it helps to bring you back into that space of dealing with reality, dealing with things as they are, and not just pretending that everything's okay when it's potentially not. But it's also about understanding it, because your resistance is happening for a reason. So rather than just trying to push past it, which may work, or more than likely will not work, it's about first understanding, well, why is it happening? If you are resisting doing something or making a change or sticking to that, what's actually going on underneath the surface? So really take some time to dig into that. And that leads me to my second point, which is, once you're aware and you've accepted that you're feeling resistance, it's then about really understanding why. This involves digging into it and seeking to understand what is really going on. So for example, I've talked quite openly about the fact that I relapsed into emotional eating. Now, if I just tried to take the chips out of my hand and stop myself from emotional eating, do you know what happens? Give it a few hours and I'm back in the same boat. But by actually taking a step backwards and saying, what is really going on here? What's happening underneath the surface? And digging into that a little bit deeper. And in fact, I actually covered this in episode 7, Let's Talk About Baggage, where I went through a technique called the 5 whys, where you actually follow this process in terms of asking why something is happening, thinking about what your answer is, and then actually looking at that answer and saying, okay, well, why was that the answer that I gave? I won't go into it here because this is a short video, but I would encourage you to either check out the audio or you can read the full transcript. All of those are available for free at letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au/episodes. Tip number 3 is, once you've actually dug in to understand what's going on, address the root cause instead of focusing on the symptoms. So you need to understand what is really happening and then address that. So instead of, let's use catching the cold or a flu as an example. If you just treat the sneeze, you are not actually addressing the root cause, which is the flu itself. And that's what happens when it comes to resistance. In fact, that's something that's applicable with all of mental health. When you're dealing with issues, usually what you're seeing is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the symptom or one aspect of what's really going on inside your mind. If you take the time to actually sit back and dig deep and be objective about understanding what is really going on, you can identify the root cause and then actually address that. If you address the root cause, you have a higher chance of actually creating sustainable and lasting change. Point number 4 is to reframe your resistance. Quite often we get caught up in saying things to ourselves like, I can't do this, or I'm too busy to do this. When if you actually reposition that to say something like, right now I don't want to do this, or I'm finding it challenging to do this because of my resistance. What you're doing is actually being really thoughtful about what's going on and acknowledging that you are actually experiencing resistance rather than letting yourself just put up more barriers. The word cannot is a very dangerous word because it means that you're putting up a wall. And we all know what happens when we smack our head against the wall repeatedly. We get the ouchies and the wall still stands. So break down your walls, or at least find a way around them. And then my 5th and final point for this episode is to revisit your priorities and be clear on how the task or action fits into those priorities. This is something I talk about a lot in my podcast and here on YouTube, which is that if things actually do matter, if they're part of your top 3 to 5 priorities, then make it matter. But if it does not matter, if it's not aligned to whatever's most important to you in life, then let it go. I think we get so hung up on doing the things that we think that we're required to do when we don't often take a step back and say, is this actually really in my best interest? Is this a healthy choice? Am I setting myself up for success? And am I helping myself in the future to become the best version of myself possible? So, look, if you're feeling resistance around doing something and it is aligned with your priorities, then you do need to find a way to push past that. And in episode 65, I go into that in a lot more detail. But if it's not part of your priorities, then maybe what you're actually experiencing is resistance because intuitively you know that it's really not that important. So if it's not, let it go. If you would like the full episode, please visit letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au/episodes and find episode 65, Let's Talk About Resistance. You can also listen now on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever fine podcasts are found. Follow Let's Talk About Mental Health on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest at LTA Mental Health for additional content throughout the week. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I hope you found this content useful. If you liked it, please subscribe and give a thumbs up. Look after yourself and make a conscious effort to share positivity and kindness out into the world because you get back what you put out. Take care and talk to you next time.